Hey, it's Ed here again, and I've had a few people comment about not going into enough detail with the logic preferences about the recording options. So I just thought I'd actually go through some of those with you, and I'm going to start off just by giving you like a brief overview, looking at the actual preferences here, and then later on I'll actually show you some examples of what each one actually does. Personally, I would say if you just want the super quick option, I like to use the create track alternatives for the MIDI, and you'll see why soon. And for audio, I still prefer the take folders because I can go and do some cool editing later on. And for the replace mode, I usually go content punch, so it actually just goes in and just replaces the MIDI content of a region when you punch into it. So let us have a quick look. What we've got here, and cycle off basically just means if you're just playing along in Logic and you start recording and it kind of blends into another region, which is what it means by overlapping. If you're not overlapping, then it's just, you're just recording onto a track basically, so none of these things make any difference, so that's why it says overlapping. For the moment, we can sort of go with both of these at the same time, and there's a couple of options that are slightly different. But with cycle on, you're basically just going round and round in a circle, and it has to do something every time it jumps back and overlaps itself. So what do you want it to do? First thing is, the default seems to be merge, and that's a little bit of an old school solution. It was really designed for, let's say if you're doing drums, and what you could do is start recording and then just play your kick note, so it's playing your kick pattern, and then you can start playing a hi-hat, and then you could play a snare, and it would just merge all of your playing into the same MIDI region, which can be kind of handy. But if you're doing anything other than that, and if you try and repeat anything when it jumps back over itself, it's just going to add more and more MIDI notes until it turns into this huge clutter of sound. So I don't recommend merge. That's kind of like, I don't know why it defaults to it, but yeah. Merge current recording is kind of a similar thing. It just means if there's already anything on that track, it will kind of leave it there as its own layer. So it's basically just kind of like it sits underneath. The old one doesn't get wiped, but the new one will kind of start doing that merge thing over and over. And then you can separate them afterwards. So I guess that's a slightly more useful version of merge. I would say neither of them are particularly useful, to be honest, but that's my take on it. Create tracks means every time it goes around, it will create a new virtual track to put that content on. And I'll show you an example of that. So as you're recording around, it'll keep stacking more and more tracks below it. And it will tend to, as you can see with cycle on, it'll... with this one, it won't mute it, so you'll hear everything that you play. So it'll keep going round and round, and it's almost the same as if you got merged, but it's split into different tracks. You'll still hear everything you've played previously all playing back to you, which will turn into a giant cacophony if you're doing anything kind of chordal. Create tracks and mute, what that will do is every time it goes around and creates a track, it will mute the previous takes. It'll mute the actual region on that track, so that you can't hear it. So you're only ever kind of hearing what you're playing until you hit stop, and then you'll hear the last one that you are working on, and it's up to you to go back and unmute each of the other ones and have a listen and see what you want to do, and you can edit them together manually at that point. So if you're going to do create tracks and mute is probably the best way to go. And create track alternatives, which is the one I prefer. So it goes around and it creates an alternative track. If any of you have used Pro Tools, it's like Pro Tools playlists. It's almost like each track can have a snapshot of a different content on it. So you can have different regions, and it can be audio or MIDI, by the way. So all those things can kind of change, and it's like a stack. All the other versions of that track are hidden underneath, and you can flick up and down to the different versions of it. And you can see all of them at the same time if you want, and then you can cut and paste between them, or cut things and drag them around. And it's only the very top layer of that stack that you will ever actually hear and see. So you can see there I've got, in this case, I've got several different letters. It uses letters to kind of name them. And you can see there that by default, if you don't have the visibility turned on the track header to see track alternatives, then you won't see them. But if you've used them, they'll show up. So this is a really handy thing to use, actually. So, and of course, take folder, which is kind of handy in a sense. It's a bit like the take folder for audio. The only trouble with the MIDI version of it is you can't select parts of each take. If you want to select a part of each take, you have to cut that take folder into a chunk, and you can select different takes from each side of it, or multiple sides. So you can split it into a bar. You can make 4 different take folders, sliced at a bar, and then change which take you want for each of those bars. So that's kind of a bit of a workaround. It's kind of clunky. I don't think Logic has ever really nailed the transparent editing of MIDI. But anyway, this gives you some different flavors of how to do that. The content punch, while we're on MIDI, is really just about if you're actually doing a punch-in. A punch-in is basically where you're playing back a MIDI region, and then you want to punch in and start recording. And at that point, what do you want to happen to what's already on there when you hit record? Do you want to erase the entire region the moment you hit record? Or do you want to just chop into an existing region where you start recording, and it'll only erase from that point? So that's basically kind of like, that's the 2 options there. It's like it'll erase that chunk where you're recording, whereas punch will kind of leave everything intact and only replace it where you've actually played something. So a good way of looking at it is region erase and content erase. If you punch in and you don't play anything, it will still wipe that chunk where you've been punched in for. Whereas with region punch and content punch, it will only delete things when you've played something. That's probably the best way of looking at it. And content punch will only delete the MIDI data over that specific part that you've punched in on, whereas region punch will cut a big hole in your region. Anywho, those things you can work out yourself. I prefer content punches. It sort of does the least amount of damage. Okay, looking at audio, very similar again. You've got like a couple of different things you can do. There's less options because you're dealing with audio and not MIDI data. You can create a take folder, and I still recommend this as probably the best option if you want to wrangle parts of different takes. Some people are still I'll do a complete take myself, thanks, and just play it the way it's meant to be. I say good on you if you can get away with doing that kind of thing. Fantastic. If you're like me and you tend to be creating or writing your music as you're going, you're going to have a lot of mistakes and a lot of half-assed ideas that you're trying out, and you're going to be doing a lot more editing. So in my case, I use take folders a lot to comp together my best ideas. It's part of that curation process when you are creating stuff, and then you've got to choose the best bits. That's curation. Create new track is basically where every time you go around or you overlap, it will actually create a new virtual track and put the content on there. Just be careful with that because it doesn't create a new channel strip in your mixer. It just creates a new virtual track, so you can only ever hear one of those takes at a time anyway. So because only one thing can play through that channel strip. And I think it's the top one that you hear. So whatever one's on the top is the one that will play. If you cut a hole in that region, it'll play the next one underneath it. So just be a bit wary of it with that one. So that's what that does. Create track alternatives, again, like I mentioned with the MIDI ones. They are in layers. So basically just start stacking them into kind of hidden layers that you can go back and dive into and grab stuff out of later on. I do use track alternatives a lot. I use track alternatives for my MIDI because it's a good way of just capturing everything and then going back and just picking and chopping out the bits that I want. With audio, I tend to use take folders, and then when I want to flatten the take folder, I'll create a track alternative so that when I flatten it, I can always jump back to an alternative that still has the take folder on it. So I can always change my mind later on. So that's a good combination to go with. I do find the one downside of using take folders is that if you have like a section and then you back up and you want to carry on. So you might do a verse and you go, okay, now I'm going to do the chorus. If you're recording on that same track, if you start recording within a bar of the end of the section before it, it'll merge them together into the same take folder. So I find that a little bit annoying. So what I do is I actually create a separate track and kind of do a checkerboard as I go down the song. So each chunk stays in its section. So I have a verse section, pre-chorus section, a chorus section, or whatever. They don't all merge together into one giant take folder with like a billion takes in it. There you go. So hopefully that's giving some clarity. Be aware that most of the stuff in here can also be accessed up here in this menu, the record menu. So yeah, you can see down there, overlapping MIDI recordings, that's all that same stuff, overlapping audio. It's a bit easier to get to when it's in this bit here. You can also say what happens when you hit the record button or the R command on your keyboard. The default is record, but record toggle is quite a good way if you want to just do punch-ins. It means that you can actually hit play and it will play along. And then when you hit R, it will punch in and record. And then when you hit R, it'll punch out again and carry on. So it's a good way of like doing punch recordings. I tend to leave this record toggle on. Other things that's quite handy, this is where you show whether you're using your musical grid or your time grid. So if you're doing bars and beat-based stuff, basically you're looking at your bars, and I've got my secondary ruler turned on to see the time, and you can flip it around the other way by going back into record, musical grid. If you turn that off, now you'll see time, and the bars are at the top as a secondary ruler. So it's quite good. So if you're doing mastering, for example, I wouldn't have on musical grid. Allow quick punch-in is a really handy thing as well. So that allows you to do those punch-ins. You can still do it without that turned on. So I can still be going along and then toggle record. But what will happen is it'll actually kind of mute the audio briefly because it has to take into account any latency through plugins and all that kind of stuff. Whereas if you leave that turned on, record, missed it again, allow quick punch-in, it's always in that record mode. So it's pretty much always ready to record. Just be aware that if you've got an audio track active and armed, that even if you hit play, technically it's recording all the time. So every time you hit play, it's actually recording. And then when you hit the R button or the record button, it's just starting the recording region from that point. It's actually really started recording from when you hit play. So just be aware if you're like on a big session and it's struggling and you arm an audio track and hit play, it's going to put a bit of extra load on there and be struggling a bit more. So you might want to turn it off at that point. It's also a sneaky way of like if you're just jamming along with audio. By the way, just as a little heads up, make sure you name a track before hitting the little record arm button. I'm just going to mute that because I don't want to hear myself. When I hit play, this is actually recording, and even if I just punch it into recording for a brief instant, like that, and then stop it again, and then if I hit stop, if I hit the space bar, this is actually recorded everything from when I hit play. So this is a really good thing to do if you're just kind of like trying to come up with ideas and you're like, oh no, I just had a really great idea, but I wasn't recording. I was just singing along as it was playing or jamming along. This is a tricky way of kind of doing a capture recording like with MIDI. It gives you this option the first time you record audio. I'm just deleting that. So it's kind of a handy thing to leave on if you can. This audio input monitoring is part of that same thing. So in case you don't know what audio input monitoring is, this goes right back to the days of analog. If you have audio on a track and you hit play, you want to hear what's on that track. If you stop and that track is armed, you want to hear what you're playing into the track. So if you're trying to tune, or if you're just sitting there with everything stopped and you're just doodling on your guitar or your bass or whatever, you can hear yourself. And when you record, you can hear what you're playing while you're actually recording it. So basically, auto input monitor just flicks between whether it's playing back what's on a track or whether it's listening to what's going into that track. Most times you'll have that on. The downside of course, is that if you just want to play along, if you've got this turned on, if you have auto input monitoring turned on, because it's basically saying when I hit play, you're going to play back that track, not what you're putting into it, you won't be able to hear yourself jamming along and practicing. So that's the downside of it. You would have to actually be recording to hear yourself, or you have to turn that off temporarily. So if you turn auto input monitoring off and that little input monitor button is on, you will just hear yourself regardless. You won't hear what's being played back, if that makes sense. Anywho, and that's kind of the guts of it. So there's a couple other little tricks that I wanted to put in there that might be kind of handy for those of you that don't know them. And so I'll just quickly go into that. If you're doing any kind of MIDI and you're just jamming along, so if you're down here somewhere, and I'll just go up to, what's this? This is my little bass synth, I think. Yeah, so if I'm down here, I'm just moving this along a bit, and I'm playing, and I just come up with something that's pretty cool. Obviously it would help if I actually had some drums. Let's just drag those out. And maybe this as well. I'm just hitting Command R to repeat that. And I go back to this and arm it. Yeah, that's terrible. But anyway, you get the picture, and you sort of go, well, that was really good. You can go up here and click this capture recording button, and that will have captured it. If you don't have the capture record button, you can just right click on a blank space up here, and you can go customize toolbar and display, and down on the left here, there's your capture recording. You can also do a key command for it. So if you're in key commands, edit, just type in capture, yeah, and you can have capture as recording. I actually don't have a key assigned to it, and capture recording and play is another one as well. And you can see it's got an asterisk, which means that you can only access this command through a key command. It doesn't have a menu. So anyway, I don't have anything assigned to it, but you can do that if you want. So there you go. So that's kind of handy. You've got that. And by the way, I don't know if you know this. This is a recent addition to Logic from a couple of versions back. But even when you're stopped and you can be doing some stuff, so if I'm down here on this electric piano, yeah, or organ or whatever, and you're just kind of jamming without even going, and if you hit that, bang, it will try and map that to whatever the tempo is. If it's the first thing you put in, it will try and actually adapt your tempo to that. If it isn't, if you're actually doing it later on, it'll try and figure out how it fits into the existing tempo. So yeah, there you go. It's like it's a handy little thing, capture record. One other quick, funky kind of thing that can be really handy is, which is kind of a record mode, but it's not really, is this thing called note repeat. And if you don't know about this, it's kind of handy. It's good for drums and stuff like that. I think it's originally designed for drums. So if I'm on this track here, I've got some drums here. There's a hi-hat. I've added note repeat to my little toolbar up here, and you can, same thing, customize toolbar, and over on the left here, note repeat, I've turned that on. There's also spot arrays, which goes hand in hand with that. And what you can do is, on note repeat, if you click on it, it's a toggle. So it's only active when you click on it and this little thing pokes up. And in here, that's what it's doing. You can basically change it, but you can also have it so you can change it while you're doing it. So if you open this little drop down, you can turn the key remote on, or you can turn on the modulation wheel. And the modulation wheel allows you to use the modulation wheel on your keyboard. So that's me just moving my modulation wheel up and down. And you can see it's changing between 1/16th and 1/64th note. And so it's a good way of kind of like jamming in or doing dubstep hi-hats, I guess, or whatever the latest fashion is. Yeah, so if you record that, now I can go. That kind of thing. And it's it's quite weird how it doesn't really appear until after you've actually done that, because I'm not doing it into an existing region, so it's just created a region after the fact, and there you go. And if you put in that spot arrays, you can actually kind of also use spot arrays to delete parts of stuff that you've played just on the MIDI note that you're playing. So if I click this, now just find it, and then I hit it and let go. So I just hit that same hi-hat note, and what it's done is it's wiped it as it's gone past it. So yeah, so that's just a way of like cleaning up stuff. So the idea is you can jam all this stuff in real time. So that is kind of another valid way of recording stuff. Just as a heads up, this also works in conjunction with whatever you've got your overlapping MIDI settings on. So if I go round and round, even using that note repeat, I'm going to be getting those same behaviors, and either take folders or alternatives or new tracks or whatever. So there you go. Hopefully that kind of clears up a little bit of stuff for you, and hopefully makes that a little bit clearer. Okay.